He shoved an old man in a dusty jacket, thinking he was just another nobody in his way. A biker drunk on ego-flexing leather and noise. But what Kyle Matthews didn't know was that the man he struck was Commander Walter Briggs, Silver Star hero. Within minutes, the sky thundered with Blackhawk blades, and a wall of veterans marched in. Stick around. They thought he owned the street. What they didn't know, he was about to face a courtroom of honor and walk through a gauntlet of justice. We love to see where our viewers are from. Comment your location and the time you found this video. Subscribe to stay connected. Kyle Matthews revved his Harley's engine, savoring the way the elderly man flinched at the thunderous sound. The convenience store's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the parking lot, highlighting the veteran's weathered face and dated military jacket. Kyle Matthews felt his leather gloves creak as he tightened his grip on the handlebars, that familiar surge of power coursing through his veins. "Watch where you're going, old-timer." Kyle Matthews sneered deliberately, letting his handlebar brush against the veteran's jacket. The old man, Walter Briggs, though Kyle Matthews didn't care to know his name then, straightened his spine with military precision. "Young man," Walter's voice carried the weight of decades of command. "I've seen your kind before. All leather and noise, no respect." Something in Kyle Matthews snapped. The leather gloves, his prized possession, his symbol of dominance, felt electric as he raised his hand. The slap cracked across the night air like a gunshot, drawing gasps from the growing crowd of onlookers. Phone cameras appeared like fireflies in the darkness, their lenses capturing every second of Kyle Matthews' moment of perceived triumph. "Nobody lectures me." Kyle Matthews growled, towering over the veteran who remained standing defiant, despite the angry red mark blooming on his cheek. Especially not some relic who thinks his service means anything anymore. The words had barely left his mouth when a young woman's voice cut through the tension. "That's Walter Briggs, you fool, Silver Star recipient, Vietnam War hero." Kyle Matthews felt the first flicker of unease, but pushed it down with practiced arrogance. He adjusted his leather gloves, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of intimidating others. The phones kept recording their artificial eyes, witnessing his growing discomfort. Type "honor" in the comments if you believe every veteran deserves respect. A bystander's voice rang out, already live streaming the confrontation. Within minutes, vet assault started trending. Kyle Matthews watched his phone notifications explode, each ping like a small explosion in his pocket. The leather gloves suddenly felt suffocating, but he couldn't bring himself to remove them. They were his armor, his identity. Looking back at that moment, Kyle Matthews would remember the subtle signs he should have heeded, the distant sound of rotors that seemed too military to be civilian, the way the crowd's phones all seemed to point at him like accusatory fingers. And most importantly, the unwavering dignity in Walter Briggs's stance. "Have you ever felt so powerful that it made you blind?" Kyle Matthews would later reflect, his voice thick with regret. "My grandfather wore gloves like these in Vietnam. He told me they represented protection, not destruction. Tonight I forgot everything he taught me about honor." The convenience store's security lights flickered, casting alternative shadows, and light across the scene like nature itself was trying to capture the perfect viral thumbnail. In the distance, a sound grew, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of military-grade rotors. Kyle Matthews felt his empire of intimidation beginning to crack. The leather gloves that had given him such confidence now felt like shackles binding him to a moment that would define his next 24 hours. The night air grew thick with tension, and somewhere in the digital ether a hashtag was about to explode into a movement. Will Kyle Matthews' reign of intimidation survive the approaching storm? Will the leather gloves that symbolized his power become the evidence of his shame? The answers would come sooner than he imagined, carried on the winds of justice and the rotors of retribution. Share this video if you've ever witnessed someone's power crumble in the face of true dignity. The next few minutes will show you how quickly a bully's world can unravel when they choose the wrong target. Kyle Matthews stared at his reflection in the police station's window, barely recognizing the man who just hours ago had felt invincible atop his Harley-Davidson. The viral video played on loop on the detective's computer screen, his own face contorted with rage as he towered over Walter Briggs, an 84-year-old veteran whose only crime had been walking too slowly across the convenience store parking lot. The leather of Kyle Matthews' signature riding gloves creaked as he clenched his fists, remembering how those same gloves had grabbed Walter's collar. Each replay of the video revealed new details he'd missed in his blind fury. The military veteran pin on Walter's jacket, the way the old man's eyes hadn't shown fear but disappointment, the gasps of onlookers whose phones captured his shame. "Your father was a Marine, too, wasn't he, Mr. Matthews?" The detective's question cut through Kyle Matthews' thoughts like a knife. The worn military photo in his wallet seemed to burn against his leg. His father, standing proud in dress blues, would have been disgusted by his son's actions. Kyle Matthews had grown up hearing stories of brotherhood, honor, respect, values he'd traded for the false power of intimidation and the roar of his bike. The detective laid out paper after paper. Complaints filed against Kyle Matthews at various bars and gatherings, a pattern of aggression that had been building for years. Each incident report showed the same progression: the revving engine, the intimidation, the rush of power he'd felt watching others scatter. The scientific term the counselor had used last year, intermittent explosive disorder, hadn't seemed real then. Now, watching himself explode on video, Kyle Matthews couldn't deny the diagnosis. Social media notifications pinged relentlessly. Veteran assault was trending, and Kyle Matthews' name was attached to every share, every angry comment. His motorcycle club's Facebook page had already posted a statement distancing themselves from his actions. The brotherhood he'd claimed to represent wanted nothing to do with him. In the corner of the room, his prized leather vest hung limply on a chair. The patches he'd earned, or thought he'd earned, seemed to mock him now. Kyle Matthews reached out to touch the road captain patch, remembering how proud he'd been when it was sewn on. Now it felt like a symbol of everything he'd corrupted. The detective pulled up another video, security footage from 3 months ago. Kyle Matthews watched himself, chest puffed out, making a young mother and her children hurry away from his parking spot. Then another from 6 months back, showing him revving his engine to scatter a group of elderly shoppers. The pattern was undeniable, each incident building toward today's explosion. "Your grandfather's memory deserves better," the detective said, quietly sliding forward a final document. Kyle Matthews' hands trembled as he recognized his grandfather's military citation, awarded posthumously for saving his entire unit. The same grandfather whose funeral Kyle Matthews had missed last year because of a bike rally. Have you ever seen your true self reflected in the eyes of others? Comment below if you've experienced a moment of painful self-realization. The weight of his leather gloves felt suffocating now. Kyle Matthews placed them on the table, each movement deliberate, like dismantling a facade he'd hidden behind for too long. Outside, he could hear motorcycles rumbling past. His former brothers riding by without stopping the sound he'd once lived for now, a reminder of everything he'd lost. His phone buzzed again. The video had reached national news networks. Kyle Matthews watched as veterans groups across the country shared his image, not in anger, but in sadness, using his actions as a teaching moment about respect and honor. The very values his father and grandfather had fought to protect, he had trampled in a moment of senseless rage. Type honor matters if you believe in holding ourselves accountable for our actions. The sun was setting outside the police station window, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at Kyle Matthews. In just 4 hours, his carefully constructed image of power had crumbled, revealing the weakness beneath. The roar of his motorcycle, once his anthem of freedom, now echoed in his memory, like a warning he'd ignored for far too long. Kyle Matthews stares at his trembling hands, the leather of his prized riding gloves, suddenly feeling like a mockery of the power he'd wielded just hours ago. The whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the approaching Black Hawk helicopter sends vibrations through his chest, each beat matching his racing heart. He never imagined his morning assault on an elderly man would trigger a military response. Through the convenience store's window, Kyle Matthews watches the helicopter descend its downdraft, scattering the papers and debris in the parking lot where he'd attacked Walter Briggs. The same lot where he'd felt so invincible, so untouchable. Now, as Commander Briggs steps out with his tactical team, Kyle Matthews feels his universe contracting. His phone buzzes again, the 100th time in the past hour. Another message from his mother. "How could you do this to our family name?" The viral video has reached 5 million views. Each share, each retweet of Zurcher biker bully feels like another nail in his coffin. Kyle Matthews swipes through the comments, his face burning with each one. Veterans don't forget their own. Justice for Walter Briggs. Watch this coward fall. Outside, the veterans begin arriving. They form perfect lines, their discipline a stark contrast to Kyle Matthews' crumbling composure. Their medals catch the afternoon sun, creating a symphony of soft metallic clicks that penetrate even the store's thick glass. The sound reminds him of handcuffs closing, a thought that makes his stomach lurch. Kyle Matthews clutches his motorcycle keys, the chrome skull keychain, no longer feeling like a symbol of rebellion, but a weight dragging him down. He'd polished it this morning before everything went wrong, before he'd decided to teach that old man a lesson for daring to comment on his parking job. Now, with every passing minute, that decision reveals its devastating consequences. Your daughter's sorority just posted a statement denouncing you, his last remaining friend texts. Kyle Matthews watches as his social media notifications explode. His bike club voting to expel him, his workplace placing him on immediate leave, his sister blocking him on all platforms. The isolation creeps in like a tide, washing away every connection he's built. The veterans outside now number in the hundreds. Their silent formation speaks volumes more than any angry mob could. Through the store's security camera feed, Kyle Matthews sees them standing at attention, a living wall of military precision. Each familiar face from the neighborhood transforms into a judge, their collected presence, a jury ready to deliver their verdict. His phone buzzes with another death threat. "You picked the wrong veteran to mess with." Kyle Matthews' hands shake so badly now that he drops his phone, the screen cracking on impact, a perfect metaphor for his splintering world. The sound of those metals clinking outside becomes a requiem for his former life. Each soft ring, another reminder of his monumental mistake. Have you ever watched your life collapse? In real time, Kyle Matthews thinks as Shodev Want biker bully hits worldwide trending. His sister's final message plays on repeat in his mind. "That man you attacked, he saved our grandfather in Vietnam. We owe everything to veterans like him. Drop one if you're standing with our veterans against bullies." The store owner who'd once greeted Kyle Matthews warmly every morning now watches him with undisguised contempt. "They're not leaving until justice is served," he says, pointing to the veterans outside. "Neither am I." Another small bell rings. As more veterans join the formation, another chime in the symphony of Kyle Matthews' downfall. The echoing clicks of camera shutters pierce Kyle Matthews' ears as he slowly removes his leather gloves, each finger feeling heavier than the last. The morning sun glints off the chrome of his parked motorcycle, once a symbol of his power, now a reminder of his arrogance. The assembled veterans, standing ramrod straight in their uniforms, create an imposing corridor leading to Walter Briggs and his son. Kyle Matthews' throat constricts as he approaches the microphone, his boots scraping against concrete in what feels like the longest walk of his life. The veterans' eyes bore into him, their collective disapproval, a weight pressing down on his shoulders. His motorcycle shop's logo on his jacket, once worn with pride, now feels like a brand of shame. "Mr. Briggs," Kyle Matthews begins, his voice cracking. The microphone catches the tremor, broadcasting his vulnerability to the crowd and the rolling news cameras. "Yesterday He pauses, swallowing hard. "Yesterday I showed the worst of humanity to a man who represents the best of it." The morning wind carries whispers through the crowd. Kyle Matthews notices his reflection in a store window. Gone is the swaggering biker who'd thrown his weight around just yesterday. The man staring back looks smaller, humbled. "My actions were inexcusable." Kyle Matthews continues, his hands gripping the podium. "I've spent the night realizing that the strength I thought I had, intimidating others, taking what I want, wasn't strength at all. It was weakness disguised as power." Commander Briggs stands at military attention, his face carved from stone. But Walter, the 84-year-old veteran Kyle Matthews, had assaulted watches with eyes that hold something unexpected. Not hatred, but a glimmer of understanding that makes Kyle Matthews's shame burn hotter. "As of this morning, I'm donating all proceeds from Matthews' custom motorcycles to veteran support programs." The announcement sends a ripple through the crowd. Kyle Matthews pulls out his shop keys, his prized possession, and holds them up. "And I'm converting the shop into a veterans community center." The click of cameras intensifies. Someone starts a slow clap that builds into applause, but Kyle Matthews raises his hand to stop it. "Don't applaud, I don't deserve it. This isn't redemption. It's the bare minimum of making things right." A reporter shouts, "Mr. Matthews, is this response to Tutter biker shame trending?" Kyle Matthews shakes his head. "This is about facing what I've become. About remembering that real strength isn't in how hard you can hit, but in how you lift others up." Walter Briggs steps forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The crowd holds its breath. Kyle Matthews forces himself to meet the elderly veteran's gaze, expecting justified contempt. Instead, Walter extends his hand, the same hand Kyle Matthews had knocked aside yesterday. "Your actions today," Walter says, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering, "show more courage than any fight could." Kyle Matthews's hands shake as he accepts the handshake. The simple gesture brings tears to his eyes, not from shame now, but from the weight of grace he knows he hasn't earned. Share this moment. Commander Briggs suddenly addresses the crowd, not to celebrate redemption, but to remind us all that change begins with facing our worst selves. Biker shame transforms to strength in humility within minutes. As the ceremony concludes, Kyle Matthews places his motorcycle keys in Walter Briggs' weathered hands. "The first donation," he says quietly, "is the thing that made me feel powerful in all the wrong ways." To type change, if you believe real strength comes from admitting our wrongs. The corridor of veterans begins to disperse, but their presence has left an indelible mark on Kyle Matthews's soul. His motorcycle gleams in the distance, no longer his, no longer a throne of false power, but a monument to the day he learned what true strength means. Kyle Matthews stares at his reflection in the polished memorial plaque at Briggs Field, his fingers tracing the words that now immortalize both his greatest shame and his path to redemption. 24 hours ago, these same hands had struck Walter Briggs in blind rage. Now they tremble as he adjusts his volunteer badge, the stark fluorescent lights of the Veterans Center catching the metal surface that reads, "Reformed, restored, renewed." The evening air carries the rich aroma of coffee and fresh-baked cookies from the center's kitchen, where Kyle Matthews helps serve the weekly gathering of veterans and young bikers. His throat tightens as Walter Briggs enters, using the same cane Kyle had knocked away yesterday. Their eyes meet in the reflection of the window, and Kyle feels the familiar surge of shame. But something else now lives alongside it. Purpose. "Your grandfather would be proud of this." Walter says, gesturing to the walls where Kyle Matthews has hung dozens of military photographs, including his grandfather's and Walter's side-by-side. The words pierce Kyle's heart like shrapnel, reminding him of the heritage he'd forgotten in his years of anger and entitlement. Kyle's hands shake as he pours coffee for a group of elderly veterans, their war stories washing over him like a cleansing rain. One of them wears a jacket identical to his grandfather's, triggering a memory that brings tears to his eyes. "I was so lost in my own pain," Kyle whispers to Walter, "that I forgot what real strength looks like." The center buzzes with activity as young bikers, many from Kyle's former crew, learn to repair motorcycles alongside veterans who once served as military mechanics. The sound of tools clicking against metal mingles with laughter and shared stories, creating a symphony of healing that Kyle Matthews never thought possible. A local news crew arrives to document the transformation of the convenience store parking lot into Briggs Field, their cameras capturing Kyle's journey from aggressor to advocate. The reporter asks about the viral video that started it all, now approaching 10 million views. Kyle Matthews straightens his volunteer badge and faces the camera. "24 hours ago, I was a man consumed by rage, thinking strength meant dominance. Now I understand that true power lies in service, in admitting our wrongs, and in working to make things right." His voice carries across the field as more veterans and bikers gather to listen. The hashtag #TouchBridgingTheGap trends nationwide as Kyle shares how Walter's forgiveness changed him. Sometimes Kyle Matthews tells the camera, his voice thick with emotion, "Our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations. Now, type 1 if you believe in the power of redemption." Walter approaches with a familiar photo album, and Kyle's heart nearly stops. Inside are pictures of his grandfather in his military days, standing proud in his uniform. "He rode with honor," Walter says, pointing to a motorcycle in the background. "Just like you're learning to do now." Kyle Matthews removes his volunteer badge, polishing it one last time before pinning it permanently to the center's wall of change. The metal catches the setting sun, throwing light across the faces of young and old gathered together in this space of healing. "My grandfather always said that a man's true character isn't shown in his victories." Kyle shares with the group, his voice steady despite his tears, but in how he rises from his defeats. "Yesterday I was knocked down by my own hatred. Today I stand tall in service to others." Share this story if you believe second chances can change lives. The day ends with Kyle Matthews leading a motorcycle escort for a veteran's funeral procession, his leather jacket now bearing a patch that reads, "Veteran's Guardian." As the bikes roar past Briggs Field, Kyle realizes that his grandfather's spirit has been with him all along, waiting for him to remember who he truly was meant to be. The security footage from yesterday's assault now plays on a loop at the center's entrance, not as a reminder of shame, but as a testament to transformation. Beside it, a new photo shows Kyle Matthews and Walter Briggs shaking hands, their shadows merging on Briggs Field as the sun sets on an old way of life and rises on a new dawn of understanding. In the end, Kyle Matthews stands at the center's podium, addressing a room full of veterans and bikers. "Yesterday I was the problem." He declares, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "Today I'm part of the solution. Tomorrow we ride together, bridging the gap between who we were and who we can become." The evening concludes with Kyle leading a prayer circle, his volunteer badge catching the last rays of sunlight. In this moment, Kyle Matthews finally understands that his grandfather's legacy lives on not through force or fear, but through service, honor, and the courage to change.